Welcome. I'm Miss Newroth, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee, and today we are talking about the consequences of population distribution. What are you going to learn today? First of all, geographers are concerned with studying where population is distributed. After that, they turn their attention to explaining why populations are located where they are and at what rate they are growing or shrinking. So geographers like to ask where and then why there. People who study population are called demographers, and the study of population is demography. They like to consider how things are spread out, how people are spread out, and they look at factors like age, health, gender, occupation, fertility, among many other things. Population distribution has political, social, and economic consequences, which we will discuss today. As we look at this map of where population is concentrated around the world, you may notice that population is certainly not distributed evenly among each of the 7 continents. You see that we have 4 major population clusters in the world. We have the European cluster, we have the South Asian cluster, we have the East Asian cluster and the Southeast Asian cluster. You're probably sensing a theme that the majority of the world's population is concentrated in Asia. You do also see a smaller cluster in the northeastern part of the United States, but compared with these other 4 clusters, it's not nearly as large. Now, population concentration and distribution are important for geographers to study because not only do they give us facts and statistics about places, but they help explain strange and interesting phenomena like you see in the pictures here. These 2 pictures were taken in countries that are literally right next door to each other. The first picture is taken in Mongolia, and you can clearly see wide open spaces with very low population density. The second picture was taken in China, where you can see there are places there that are incredibly densely concentrated with people. People are not spread across the planet in even distribution, and geographers are curious about why we might see so many people in one place and so few people in another. These population factors have many impacts, including political impacts. Now, in this case, I want you to consider some of the questions that a geographer might ask when they look at population concentration or population distribution. First of all, is the political system of that country or that place equipped to handle a growing or shrinking population? Consider if you were the mayor of this city or the governor of this area. How would you handle what appears to be incredible growth in this particular city? How do you make sure that the needs of the population are represented in the government? If you are a democracy, how do you make sure that everyone is able to vote when you have a rapidly growing population? Or how do you make sure a certain area is represented equally if it has a growing or a shrinking population? And finally, what kind of strain does the population place on the government to provide for basic needs? If the government provides healthcare or if the government provides transportation, if you're facing a rapidly growing population, you may have to wrestle with some of these challenges. Now, population distribution and concentration also have economic impacts. You'll see here some questions that countries may face are there enough jobs for working age people? If you have a huge number of young people entering the workforce, are they going to have a place to earn a living? Are there enough people to fill available jobs? Some countries face the opposite problem or challenge where they have a lot of jobs, but a shrinking population and not enough people to fill those jobs. They may also be facing the question, are there enough jobs in the places where people need work? So not necessarily just jobs overall, but are the jobs available in the places where people are? This leads us to social impacts. Countries may face questions like, are there enough hospitals to care for the health needs of the population? If the population is young, are there enough schools? Meaning, if the population is producing a lot of young people, are there enough schools for those people to go to? On the flip side, if the population is aging, or if there are a lot more elderly people in your population, are there enough resources for things like pensions and elder care? And a pension would be something that you would get somewhat like a retirement when you're older to help take care of you when you can no longer work. So let's think about this. Let's put these ideas and these concepts into practice. We're going to practice a skill today. And the skill that we're focusing on is explain a likely outcome in a geographic scenario using geographic concepts, processes, models, or theories. Now, this is a skill you haven't had an opportunity to do a whole lot of practice with yet in this course, but it's something that you're going to work with a lot, particularly in this unit. You'll learn a whole lot of interesting things that will allow you to make some pretty sophisticated predictions about what's going on in the world. So let's just start the idea of practicing predicting a likely outcome in a geographic scenario. So for this first one, let's imagine there is a growing young population in cities with rising needs for employment. What might be some of the consequences of this kind of situation? Now, you may be thinking, well, perhaps the government will have to step in and make sure that there are training programs for people. They may have to allow or foster some small business growth, something like that. As you start to practice with these ideas or think about these concepts on a more sophisticated level, you'll be able to start thinking about possible outcomes. Here's a second one. There is a growing cluster of people living along the coastline due to internal migration. So let's imagine that many people are moving from rural areas to a city along the coast looking for work, but now that city starts to become very densely populated. Perhaps there start to be sanitation challenges or housing challenges. So how might a society wrestle with those kinds of consequences of this kind of growth? Finally, let's imagine there is a government that is struggling to cope with an aging population due to population decline. Perhaps it's in a place where people are having fewer and fewer children, but they're also living longer and longer. What kind of consequences would happen with that? You might be thinking, well, there may not be enough people to enter the workforce, and people are getting older, but may not be able to do tough jobs like working in construction. So there may be huge needs for certain kinds of workers that that particular country may not have. These are the kind of scenarios that you may be wrestling with as you learn more of the concepts that are here to come. So let's practice very quickly before we end this video today. You see a map here with A, B, C, D, and E labeled, and it says, on the map above, which of the following boxes is an area where the population density is high and the level of economic development is low? Now, you may not know a whole lot of information about all these regions of the world just yet. One of the things that you're going to work on developing in this course is getting a strong understanding for some basic trends of different regions of the world. In the last unit, you learned about how geographers like to do regional analysis. Well, if you were to practice some of what you know here, you might have a sense that if we're looking at high population density, C or D might be great answers. They're both in the major population clusters that I mentioned earlier. However, if we're thinking about economic development being lower, you may know that India, for example, has lower economic development than Japan, which is what is represented with that D there. So you may have been able to use the process of elimination to arrive at answer option C. Let's conclude today. So geographers are interested in the where and why of population. They study where population is distributed and why populations at certain locations are growing or declining. Ultimately, why is all of this important? Well, first of all, Earth has never had nearly 8 billion people living on it at one point in time. Almost all the population growth is currently concentrated in developing countries, and that will become a major theme in the lessons to come. This has major social, economic, and political impacts. Not only that, but the late 20th century saw the highest rate of population growth in history. Think about these things as you move forward. And as I always like to say, keep your eyes open because geography is everywhere. Welcome back. I'm Miss Newroth, and I'm here today to talk with you about consequences of population distribution. What are you going to learn today? Well, first of all, geographers are interested in exploring the dynamic between population and the Earth's resources. In the last video, you learned that where people are located has political, social, and economic consequences. But where people located also has environmental consequences. We talked in the last video about how there are 4 major population clusters in the world today, 3 of the major clusters being in Asia. But as you've noticed, and as I pointed out before, there are major population clusters in other parts of the world as well. If you look at South America, you may notice that most people are concentrated along the coastlines. In the United States, we have a major population concentrated on the east coast of our country. And in Egypt, it's always very interesting to see how people are clustered very closely along the Nile River. You can even see that here in the map of the world. You can see that concentration of people right along the river. Today, we're going to be taking a look a little bit deeper at the impact of population concentration on the environment and on resources. There's actually a story behind the photo that you see here. I had the opportunity this summer to go to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for the very first time. And this picture is a little deceiving because what you don't know is that right behind me is a long, long line of cars. I was stuck in a terrible traffic jam for about 2 hours while in this absolutely spectacular place. And what I came to learn is that the Smoky Mountains National Park is one of the most visited national parks in the United States. And part of the reason for that is because there is a major population cluster in the eastern half of the United States. So, this is one of the national parks in the United States that is the easiest for a lot of people to visit because it's physically closer to them. So there is a challenge for the people who manage the park to manage the massive population that comes to visit this park every year. So there are environmental consequences of trying to dispose of trash, dealing with pollution from so many cars being there. So this would be just a small example of the consequence of population clusters on the environment. One of the terms that you'll hear is this idea of carrying capacity. So, what is this and how does it relate to overpopulation? Well, you can think about it as the relationship between 2 things: the population size and the amount of resources available. In other words, you can think about it this way: can the land and water support human life? Now, we could look at the carrying capacity of the entire planet, or we could scale down to look at the carrying capacity of a country or even a local area. In the first scenario here, there are more than enough resources for the population. So it would be below carrying capacity, and we would consider this a sustainable lifestyle. The second is where the population is matched there at the resources. There's just enough resources for that population. If the population grows, or if there aren't enough resources, it would spill over into that third category of being over carrying capacity. In this case, it is not a sustainable way to live. There are too many people for the resources available there. Now, carrying capacity is not fixed. Human actions can alter the carrying capacity. So, for instance, changes in farming techniques to focusing on more sustainable ways of farming. And not only that, but the differences or changes in the land that people are living on. If you're living in a desert environment that cannot support very much life, then the carrying capacity of a particular place may be very low, a very, very small population. Where if you live in an area with lush forests and many natural resources, that land may be able to sustain a whole lot more human life. And the picture here that you see is taken in Tanzania, where the farmers are practicing a more sustainable form of agriculture, where they are not overusing the resources. It's farming that takes place without a lot of chemicals, so that they are treating the world and their environment in a sustainable way, so that their population does not exceed the carrying capacity of their area. Now, there are basically three ways that geographers may measure population density. Now, the first is very simple. I tell my students this is simple arithmetic. It is the total number of people divided by the total land area. Pretty simple and straightforward. Now, we could stop there, but there are other ways to measure population density, especially when we consider how a population may affect the natural environment or the resources of an area. We could look at physiological density. This would be the number of people per unit of arable or farmable land. Now, this goes back to the example I gave in the last slide. If you're in a desert area, then you may have high numbers of people per farmable land because there is very little farmable land. The physiological density would be very high. Whereas if you're in an area with lots and lots of farmable land, then the ratio would be lower. And this is one way geographers can study the impact that people are having on the land around them. A third way to measure would be agricultural density. This is where a geographer would look at the ratio of the number of farmers to arable or farmable land. So do you have lots and lots of farmers trying to farm a very small amount of farmable land? Or do you have an abundance of farmable land and very few people being farmers in your society? How the people use the land, the farmable land, is also an interesting way for geographers to get a more clear picture about how humans are impacting their environment. So you might want to consider, how might these three ways of measuring population density provide geographers with different ways of understanding the relationship between people and the earth? You can pause the video and consider that now. Let's take a moment to practice with this information. I have a question here. The ability of a resource base to sustain a population is known as its, well, we've learned about ratios, we've talked about limits. In the last video, we talked about employment, we've discussed carrying capacity today, and certainly we've discussed the possibilities of population pressure on the environment. Well, if you've been paying attention, you probably know that the ability of a resource base to sustain a population is known as its carrying capacity. Finally, what should you take away from this video today? Where people are located has environmental consequences. Geographers may look at this or may determine the impact of this by looking at things like arithmetic density, physiological density, and agricultural density. And finally, by determining the carrying capacity of various places. As we move forward in the next videos, you'll have an opportunity to explore further how different populations around the world, from less developed countries to developing countries to more developing countries, have an opportunity to interact with their environment in different ways. As I always say, keep your eyes out because geography is everywhere.